My name is Skip Rutherford, Dean of the Clinton School, and welcome to another in a series of our public programs and community conversations. We're glad to have you here. Could I ask you please, as I always do, to please turn your cell phones and your BlackBerries off. They tend to interfere with the cameras and the microphone system. You know, it's a real pleasure and a personal privilege and somewhat of a homecoming for me to introduce the person who is going to introduce our speaker, because he is the president of the international advisory firm McLarty Associates. And from a Clinton School perspective, Jose Guzarde, who is sitting up here on the front row, stand up, Jose, is going to be doing his international public service project work with McLarty Associates, both in Washington and hopefully Brazil. So it's an extraordinary opportunity for Mac to make that program available to one of our students. He's the chairman of McLarty Companies, a fourth-generation family transportation and automobile business. He served in the Clinton White House as White House Chief of Staff and Special Envoy to the Americas. He's the recipient of the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Medal, the highest civilian honors awarded to him by the countries of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Nicaragua, Panama, and Venezuela. Impressive record. He's on the board of Union Pacific, Axiom, the Bush-Clinton-Katrina Fund, the Council for the Americas, and Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. We worked together at ArkLaGas and developed not only a great friendship and professional relationship, but I will tell you that he is not only one of my all-time heroes, he's one of the most honorable, decent human beings ever to serve this country. Would you welcome the former White House Chief of Staff, Mac McLarty?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be home. It's great to be home and see so many familiar faces and friends of long standing. I always look for hometown crowds, and I finally found one here. Let me try to briefly return Skip's very generous and warm introduction. Both David Pryor and President Clinton described Skip Rutherford as having more political savvy in his little finger than most politicians have in their entire bodies. Skip is not only the founder of this great political animals club here in Arkansas that has gained national and international attention, but he is someone that I cherish his friendship, and he has been unfailingly supportive of me, both as a colleague and as a friend, and he and Billy both are just the finest examples of what Arkansas brings in terms of not only integrity but skill and professionalism. And I always look forward to calling Skip Dean Rutherford when I get in this venue, and he has done a remarkable job. And Secretary Cohen's appearance in this Kennedy, this great program of speakers here is just yet another example of his leadership. It is a particular pleasure and privilege for me to introduce tonight's speaker. And indeed, my challenge will be resisting to go on far too long about him, because Bill Cohen is truly one of those rare individuals that you can appropriately call a Renaissance person. An accomplished athlete, a novelist, a poet, a public servant, a cabinet secretary, and a business executive. He is as comfortable quoting T.S. Eliot as he is debating U.S. foreign policy. And he is as skilled creating fictional geopolitical crises as he is managing real ones. He has a kind of vision that can be broad and focused, able to recognize big picture trends, but never losing sight of the way things look and feel on the ground. That was reflected in his very first campaign for the House of Representatives when he set out on foot walking 600 miles across Maine's 2nd District so he could collect his constituents' views and carry them with him to Washington. Bill Cohen was just 32, but it did not take him long to rise to national prominence as one of the first Republicans to break ranks with his party and vote in favor of President Nixon's impeachment. A courageous vote indeed. And that's the kind of integrity and independent thinking that have become a hallmark of his legislative career. Throughout his 24 years in Congress, first in the House and then in the Senate, Senator Cohen at that time stood for what the almanac of American politics called the purity of the political process, including one of the most eloquent advocates of ethics reform. I first got to know Bill Cohen when I was serving as President Clinton's chief of staff, which of course was a great privilege. And I saw for myself the civility, the decency, the spirit of constructive bipartisanship that made then Senator Cohen not only highly respected, but highly effective. On many occasions, he led the search for that common ground, for compromise, prompting one angry constituent to call his office to complain, "He is simply too darn reasonable." Bill was proud to be a moderate, even when it was no longer in vogue. He believed then, and he believes now, that we need to work together despite the increasing political polarization we see in our country. But by 1996, he had concluded it was time to retire from the Senate. He had been married that year on Valentine's Day to a truly remarkable woman, his wonderful wife and soulmate, Janet Langhart. And he was ready to move on with a different chapter in his life. But President Clinton had a different idea for Bill Cohen and for our country. After winning re-election in 1996, the President asked Senator Cohen to become Secretary of Defense, the highest-ranking position a Republican had held in a Democratic administration in modern memory. Managing that bureaucracy, the largest in our government, is a formidable challenge. But Bill Cohen and his team handled those enormous responsibilities in a seamless, skilled, and superb manner. As Secretary of Defense, he oversaw the largest defense spending increase in 15 years, a successful air campaign that ended Serbia's fighting in Kosovo, the addition of 3 new democracies in NATO, the reduction of nuclear weapons in Russia, expanded military ties between the United States and China, and he was an absolutely tireless ambassador for enlisted personnel securing salary and housing improvements for our military men and women. And throughout his tenure, Secretary Cohen represented the best of American leadership, understanding that whether as a nation, a military institution, or an individual, often the greatest power we have is the power of our own example. In his case, it's an example of thoughtfulness, patriotism, grace, and humanity, all of which are beautifully captured in the memoir that he and Janet wrote last year. You know, as I was preparing for this event and looking forward to it, I did a little homework and came across some remarks that President Gerald Ford made almost 33 years ago at a luncheon in Portland, Maine. A young Congressman Cohen had spoken first. And here's how President Ford responded. He said, "Some people who come to the Congress, they are like Greyhound buses. They come and go very quickly. But Bill Cohen, I could tell the minute he walked in was a person of great capability. He has done everything not only up to expectations, but beyond expectations that I would have anticipated. Bill Cohen is indeed a person who consistently exceeds even our highest expectations. Please join me in giving him our warmest Arkansas welcome tonight at the Clinton School of Public Service. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Wow, have you set me up? Mac, that's probably the most generous and gracious introduction I think I've ever had. In my 31 years of public service, I don't think anyone has taken the time to go back and look at my career in a retrospective as you have. But I must tell everybody here that it's a mutual admiration society because, as Dean Rutherford has said, there isn't a man in Washington who has more respect for his integrity and his decency and his honesty and capability than Mac McClarty. And in fact, when I first was offered the position of Secretary of Defense, I went to Mac and said, what do I do now? How do I handle this? What would you recommend? This is highly unusual. It's never been done. And I didn't want to be like the Candidate. You remember the Robert Redford movie, The Candidate, where he starts off all idealistic and at the very end says, what do we do now? Well, the one person I went to was Mac McClarty. And he gave me great advice. He helped me get through a difficult transition period. And he and I have become great friends. Our wives have become great friends. Donna and Janet are close, and he and I do some things in the business world as well. But Mac, thank you for arranging for me to come to the school and to say a few words to you. I wasn't sure how I'd begin today. After listening to Mac's, I could have listened to you all day, by the way. I started to believe most of it, as a matter of fact, as you went through. But I'll tell you, as a young man, I had two aspirations. When I went to Bowdoin College, believe it or not, I had aspirations of playing professional basketball. That I'm standing up here, if I had this height, I might have made it. But it was a goal of mine to play professionally. I came close, but not quite. And the second goal I had was to become a Latin professor. And my colleagues in the Senate used to kid me. They said, you've achieved both of your dreams. You continue to dribble while speaking a dead language. But something happened on the way to Bowdoin College. I was big man on campus and captain of the basketball team, and I was in a freshman English class. And the professor assigned a sonnet to all of the class members. I said, a sonnet? You don't understand. I am the captain of the basketball team, and real men don't write sonnets. And I said, besides, I'm traveling with the team. I won't have time. I tried to give him every lame excuse I could think of. And he said, Mr. Cohen, you will write a sonnet or you will fail. And that was the instruction. I was beside myself, frankly. I had never read any of Shakespeare's sonnets or any sonnets for that matter. Didn't know what to do. I was almost resigned to flunking the course. I finally went to a library one evening, and I was flipping through a magazine that had an article talking about the relationship of the seasons and the mating instinct among animals. And I said, I wonder if it applies to people. And so I wrote my little sonnet, which to this day I can recite and will do so today. Winter freezes summer blood to ice, and it chills the passions that await the spring. The lover suffers season sacrifice at altars bleak with crystal covering. Now, what heart can hold a love in winter's time when even nature slacks her passion pace, when minor creatures flee the upper clime for warmer realms of burrowed space? But spring has courage to oppose the cold, and it passes on to those in love the same. The sound of life and love take hold of human ears that closed at winter's name. Ah, but is it fair to unimpassioned reason to say that love depends upon a season? Turned it in. I got a C. But you know what? It opened my mind to a whole different world, another world of literature. And had I been just going and bouncing the ball down, trying to please some of my fraternity brothers who would sit in the stands and drink beer and holler and yell, I might have had an entirely different life. But as a result of that one professor saying, you must do something different than what you think that you're here to do, it opened up a new life for me. And I started reading from that point forward, and it made a big difference when I decided to leave. When I left Bowdoin, didn't make the pros, then had to decide, what do I do with my life? Well, I go to law school, because I was told by friends, the law school will sharpen your mind by narrowing it, which it did. And so you come from this great liberal arts background, and suddenly you're focused on case law and the memory and the cases you have to decide. And then, of course, I graduated. I did quite well in law school, and then I went back to my hometown in Bangor, Maine. And at that time, I had no designs, no desire to get into politics. I was going to be a trial attorney, which is what I did. But again, it's sort of like that famous quote, life has to be lived forward, but it can only be understood backwards. Kierkegaard said that. And you think about all of us who are in this room right now. How many of us started out thinking we knew exactly where we were going to be? And we look back over our shoulders today, and we say, how in the world did I get to where I am today? All of the choices that we've made, the decisions that we didn't make, who have led us to this point in our lives. And so we try to go back and reflect, how did we get here? And that has been important to me, to look back and find those little decisions that were made either for me or by me. Because when I went back to practice law, all you could do at that time was advertise, and the best way is engage in public service. You couldn't advertise as a lawyer, so how would anyone judge your capability as a lawyer? Well, you volunteered. And you volunteered for the Parks and Recreation Committee, the Zoning Board of Appeals, or you run for city council, you become a county prosecutor, assistant county prosecutor, but you hold yourself out to the public and let them see who you are, and then make a judgment on whether they want to utilize your services as an attorney, and that's the way it was done. And that's the way I think is the best way as a professional, rather than running ads on television saying what a great attorney you are. But something happened during that period of my life, and had a lot of people came to me and said, you really ought to run for Congress. And as Mac has pointed out, I decided to run by walking. And it was an extraordinary experience, because I walked an average of 22 miles a day. I stayed with a different family picked at random at night. Most people said, okay. I would knock, and can I stay here tonight? And they would say yes. Some were embarrassed they didn't have a bed. I said, it's okay, I'll sleep in a chair. But what we did, and I did during that time, was to meet these families in their homes. And we would have dinner, and they would invite 10 or 12 people over afterwards and say, tell me what your lives are like, and what would you like me to do in terms of representing you when I get to Congress. And it turned out it was a 600-plus mile walk. I ended up in the hospital on 2 occasions with having to have some surgical treatment for my feet because I was very naive. I was wearing construction boots because I thought that would give me the ankle support that I needed. Well, bad decision. I didn't know anything about Nike in those days at all. And then I would give my boots away when I'd go to a town and they were having a little bean supper raising money, and I would give my boots away and then go out and buy a new pair of boots the next day. And anyway, I won't go into the details, but it was gruesome. Plus, I gained 22 pounds. I walked 600-plus miles. I gained 22 pounds. Why? How was that possible? People would come out and see me on the highway. They say, you must be terribly thirsty. Here's a milkshake, or here's an ice cream, and et cetera, et cetera. I'd have 2 dinners where people would invite me into their homes and say, you must have dinner with my family tonight. It was a wonderful experience. But I learned a lot about public service during that walk, and I continued that walk. I did it again the next year, going horizontally across the state, and tried each year to walk at least 100 miles to stay in touch with people. And it was a great career I had until 1996. I was in the House for 6 years, 18 years in the Senate, and then along came 96, and I decided I'd had enough. 24 years on Capitol Hill is a long time. And I found that things were getting too partisan. I looked at my life, and I've always had what I call a Gothic preoccupation with time. I could always feel the sands running through the hourglass all the time, and I said, what am I doing? We are not doing the people's will. Things are going unaddressed. We are so tied up with trivia that we're not dealing with the big issues. And I thought that maybe it was just time to have new people come in who didn't have the burden of the prior legislative wars that were taking place, and that it was time for people to come in. And my own state of Maine passed a resolution or referendum, didn't apply to members of Congress, but applied to the state, saying two-term limitation. I really didn't think that was a wise thing. 2 terms, we have term limits. They're called elections. And if you don't like your member, then you vote them out. But nonetheless, that was the sentiment at the time, and I said, well, I've had 3. I've had 3 in the House, I've had 3 in the Senate, maybe it's time for somebody else. And so I left, and you know, in those days, growing up as a young boy, if you couldn't be President of the United States, the next best thing would be a member of the United States Senate. And in those days, you left office one of 2 ways. You either were defeated or you died. Very few people ever left the Senate voluntarily. The year that I left, there were 13 of us. And I think it was the largest number ever prior to that time. And we all had different reasons, family reasons, me concerned about time running out and wanting to do other things. But at the core of it was this notion that things aren't being addressed. This is too much paralysis, too much political maneuvering, not enough dealing with the people's issues. And so I decided I was going to go out and form my little consulting firm, and I had my cards all printed up. I had just signed a lease for office space, and then something happened on the way to becoming a businessman. President Clinton called. And it was probably the most remarkable turning point in my life that I wasn't sure, it's not something I sought. I was determined to go out into a brave new world, and President Clinton, after 2 discussions, said, I'd like you to be my Secretary of Defense. And it was a very bold move on his part. It had never been done before. And to have an elected official from another party serve in that capacity was really a bold stroke on his part, and a very courageous one. And it wasn't going to be without controversy. We discussed it in terms of Republicans would disown me, and Democrats would be skeptical. That first cabinet meeting was something that I will not quite ever forget. And I said, how did he get in here? And do we have to watch what we're saying, et cetera, et cetera? And is he going to be going through the back door to his friends up on Capitol Hill and revealing all of our secrets? None of that. President Clinton set the tone. And he said, I want to see a bipartisan consensus in this country for a national security policy. And I'm going to pick a Republican and put him in there and ask you to work with him. And for 4 years, it was an incredible experience. And Mac was kind enough to mention Janet, my wife. And she went with me. We traveled some 800,000 miles, going all over the world, meeting with kings and emirs and queens and all that, but mostly our troops, the kids who were out there in the field. And it was an extraordinary experience to go out there and see how young they were. They're 18 and 19 and 20 and 21. And to see them aboard an aircraft carrier where every single person on board that carrier, 5,000 people, yet everybody had a job. Everybody had something important to do, life important, because a mistake could cost any one of them their lives. And so to see how we have taken these young people of ours and trained them and put them out and deployed them forward, it was a remarkable experience for us. And I think the highlight of that was President Clinton's final address to the nation. The State of the Nation in the year 2000, when he stood up, and my wife was sitting up in the gallery, and he said, I want to thank Janet Cohen for everything she's done. She stood up, and she was in tears, obviously, but it was a moment where the 2 of us had worked very hard to relate to our troops, to thank them for what they give up, what they sacrifice, their families, what they go through. And I always treated my job as Secretary of Defense. I look at these kids, And I would say, I treat every one of them as one of my sons or daughters. And I sat and signed every deployment order that goes out every day. I sat and signed each one and asked questions. Where are they going? Why are they going? What's the rationale? When were they coming back? Because you would want me, as Secretary of Defense, to feel that I wouldn't put them in a place of harm or in harm's way without a very good reason. And I felt personally responsible for their lives. And so when you go out into the field and you see them, and you relate to them, and you listen to what their stories are and what they need, you come back, and I'll tell you, there's nothing like being Secretary of Defense. You're representing the finest military in the world. These kids are they're dedicated, they're intelligent, they're highly educated, they're motivated, they're can-do, and you walk into that building and you just come alive. And so it was a great experience for me to be in that position and to have a president who gave me almost total free rein. I don't think we disagreed on more than 3 or 4 items in the whole 4 years. And if you can bat 90% in the game, so to speak, you're doing pretty well. But President Clinton was great to me. Whenever we had an issue of disagreement, we would have Sandy Berger, who was then the National Security Advisor. He would say, we got to minimize everything going up to the president. We can't have every dispute between state and DOD and the chiefs get before the president. So let's minimize it, and we did. But if we had fundamental differences, we would go to an Oval Office meeting or a cabinet room meeting, and President Clinton would listen to us make our arguments, and he'd decide. But an incredible, great experience for which I am ever grateful. I thought today what I might do is tell you that I kept 2 quotes under my desk at the Pentagon. And I want to read the 2 quotes to you because I still carry them with me. Our earth is degenerate in these latter days. Bribery and corruption are common. Children no longer obey their parents. Every man wants to write a book. And the end of the world is evidently approaching. Sounds pretty familiar. They were written 4,700 years ago on an Assyrian tablet. The second quote that I kept next to me, it's a gloomy moment in the history of our country. Not in the lifetime of most men has there been so much grave and deep apprehension. Never has the future seemed so uncertain as it does at this time. The domestic situation is in chaos. Our dollar is weak throughout the world. Prices are so high as to be utterly impossible. The political cauldron seethes and bubbles with uncertainty. Russia hangs as usual like a cloud, dark and silent upon the horizon. It's a solemn moment of our troubles, and no man can see the end. Again, it could be in the Wall Street Journal editorial, Harper's Weekly Magazine, 1897. So I kept those there, and I would look at them every day and say, we've always had problems, we've always had challenges. Somehow we've managed to overcome them. We're in a different world, however. I have to keep reminding myself, that was then, this is now. And you look at what has transpired in the world. 9/11 has been burned into our consciousness in terms of what happened. It was a transforming moment for all of us. And I would frequently be asked the questions, how could this have happened to us? Why did it happen? Will it happen again? And what can we do to stop it? Well, there are a lot of reasons in terms of how did this happen. It's pretty clear we dropped our guard. We simply lost control of who was coming into the country or how long they were staying, and being rather lackadaisical about it. We're sitting on our crown in the corner and simply not thinking that anyone would dare to attack us in our homeland the way they did. The why is a little more difficult. Some people believe that we were attacked because of our philosophy, our values, that we believe in an open democratic society. We embrace all religions and ethnicities, that we try to have equality of the genders, etc. And that this is fundamentally antithetical to those who live in the Arab world. And so you have these extreme elements who say that they have a different philosophy. So the question is of who we are is what really is the fundamental reason that we were attacked. But there are others who say it's not who we are, but where we are. In other words, that we are in a region that is seen by them as being a violation of their sovereignty and of their religion. And so our very presence in the Gulf region is seen as a source of anger, resentment, indeed the desire to kill as many as they can. I'm not sure it really matters in terms of why they had conducted the 9/11 attack, but the fact is it's a reality of today. That is it going to happen again? Most people will tell you yes. It's inevitable. I've always believed that nothing is inevitable until it happens, but I think there is a certain inevitability about attacks that will come in the future simply by virtue of the fact we're so big. We're so porous. Our borders are porous. The Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific, they don't protect us. They can't insulate us anymore. And so if you think about the numbers of people who now have access to coming into our country and the inability of us to patrol every line of border, then it becomes pretty easy to see how someone can slip across and carry out an attack. And so there's a certain inevitability about it. So then the question becomes, well, what can we do? What can we do to stop it? Well, there are things that we can do defensively. We used to have our whole strategy was summed up in 3 words. It was called deter, defend, defeat. That was it. You deter an adversary from attacking you by having the most powerful military in the world. No one can match us in terms of our nuclear capabilities, and no one can match us on a conventional head-to-head basis with our conventional forces. But of course, they're not engaged in conventional warfare. They're engaged in a different kind of warfare. And so anyone who is prepared to die in order to carry out their mission becomes a much more difficult enemy to defend against. So what do? You can protect your soldiers in the field as best we can. We've seen that we've been vulnerable in the field, putting our forces out when they didn't have adequate armor on the Humvees and other vehicles. So we've had to make corrections and have what they call MRAPs, much more armor protected to give greater protection to our forces. We've prepared them for chemical or biological warfare scenarios, but that's them in the field. What about you? What have we done to protect you? And that's something that hasn't really been fully addressed, at least to my satisfaction. And the question becomes, how do we protect the American people at home? And so what we had is a program that was initiated by Congress, and the program called for us to train roughly 150 cities. So you've got to have in place a plan for what takes place when there is an attack in your city. And you can see by virtue of Katrina, I mean, this was Mother Nature's weapon of mass destruction, wasn't it? You need the same capability for Mother Nature as you do for a terrorist attack at home. You need to be thinking ahead. What sort of preparations do we have to make? What about transportation, communication, evacuation, inoculation? All of the things that one has to do when you have tragedy strikes on a massive scale. And so that's what we have been trying to prepare for, that to deal with the consequences. It's called consequence management. How do you manage the consequence of something being released in your city, a radiological bomb, possibly a nuclear device that has exploded, or a biological attack? All of these, and it could be Mother Nature again. I mean, 1918, there was something like 50, possibly 100 million people who died during 1918 from the flu. And most scientists are predicting we're going to see a repetition of that flu attack. Only this time, you're talking about 500 million people by virtue of the fact that we become so globalized. You think about it, a flu or a biological agent is only a handshake away, or a plane ride, or a cloud. There are no borders anymore that protect us against this kind of attack from a natural source. Remember what happened a few years ago with SARS over in Asia? If any of you ever travel, by way of example, if you ever go to Singapore, I'd like to point Singapore out, I go there frequently. If you come off the plane and you start to go to the baggage area, if you look up, you'll see some cameras. You would assume that they're monitoring your movement because that's something that everyone is doing that. They're not monitoring your movement as much as measuring your body temperature. They're measuring the heat in your body. And you say, why would they want to do that? Because they want to know whether you have a high temperature. If you have a high temperature, are you carrying a virus? If you have a virus, it can destroy our country, which is what almost happened with SARS. So you can see that technology is now going to play an even bigger role in our lives in terms of dealing with these issues. So we have to prepare ourselves for the worst and make sure that we have in place mechanisms whereby we can reduce, hopefully we can eliminate the threat, but that's probably going to be impossible. So we have to now think of ways in which we can minimize the damage that's done, that we can be resilient. This is something that we see with the Israelis, for example, that they're a resilient country. They've had bombings, but they're able to respond and come back. What we can't afford to do is to think that we're going to have 1 or 2 more attacks here and it will destroy our country. So preparation is going to be key. I don't want to dwell too heavily on all the negative side of things because there's so much more that we can talk about this afternoon. For me, in terms of security, you can't think of it in terms of just military action. I mean, I mentioned before we said deter, defend. We're trying to defend the American people, and now defeat. Well, how do you defeat an enemy that you can't even identify? You can play defense so long, you know this in business and you know this in sports, if you're always playing defense on your heels, you're going to lose. So you have to play good defense, but you also have to have a good offense. Now, we went on the offense in Afghanistan, and the world was with us. The world wasn't quite with us when we went into Iraq, and we can debate that, but I choose not to debate the wisdom or lack of wisdom in going into Iraq. The fact is that we are there now, and the question is how do we get out of there in a way that still protects our national security interests? And that's a debate which is taking place at the political level. Since I am a world affairs analyst for CNN, I don't have to get into the politics of it. I just try to analyze it. I spend a good deal of time over there. I'm going over there Friday again, and I will meet with various leaders throughout the Gulf region. And they are worried. They're worried on 2 accounts. Number one, they're worried that we're going to leave precipitously, and they're worried about Iran expanding. And they are scared enough that they're now talking about how they can actually cooperate regionally and building up and beefing up their own defenses. But they understand that if the United States were to leave tomorrow or within a year, that the forces of chaos are there, that the insurgency is going to remain, that the split between the Sunni and the Shia is going to continue, and that they may find their own prosperity suddenly taken away. If you think about what's happened over there, any of you have traveled to the Gulf region, you can't even conceive of the amount of wealth that has been transferred to that region by virtue of $100 a barrel for oil. And I'd like to point out, as I did earlier, that's the floor. It's never going below that. It's only going to go higher. You're not going to see a return. 4 years ago, it was $28 a barrel. And I remember talking to the Saudi ambassador. He said, well, we want to keep it between 28 and 32. And here we are, 4 years later, we're now at 100, and it's probably going to go up much higher than that, particularly if there is any kind of spread of the insurgency and the Sunni fighting the Shia in the region. So they're worried, and we have to deal with their worries as well, because what we have to point out is that the world is really riding on our back on this. If you think about it, people say, well, you shouldn't have gone, it's your problem. It's not only our problem anymore. Because whether it's China or Russia or any of the other countries who depend upon having access to energy in that region, their futures are just as much at play as ours. So if we were to leave and if we were to see this disorder continue to spread, that could have an impact. That could send prices skyrocketing beyond anybody's ability to afford it. And so they have an interest in this. It's another reason why, let me come back to Iran. I'm going to stop in a moment because I was told to reserve at least a half hour for your questions and hopefully a couple of answers. But Iran, I have just returned from China. And I continue to meet with Chinese officials and try to impress upon them the need for the Chinese government to weigh in much heavier with Iran than they currently have to date. Now, China has been helpful with North Korea, the 6-party talks. They understand the danger of having a nuclear-armed North Korea continue to build its forces. They've been very helpful in that regard. They have been helpful to some degree in Iran, but here's the problem. If Iran continues, and you saw the news yesterday or today, where they have built more centrifuges, if they continue unabated to develop a nuclear weapon, guess what happens? Every other country in the region says, we have to do the same. Now, they've already announced that the GCC states have said, we intend to pursue nuclear power as an alternative source of energy. That's French for nuclear weapons. That's what they're talking about. And other countries, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the UAE, all of the other countries also will feel compelled to have nuclear weapons. So now you're going to have the spread of more and more technology in more and more countries with less and less control. What does that bode for the future for us, but also for them? Because it's in their interest not to see this take place. China's doing quite well, thank you. They've been growing at 10 and 12%. They now manufacture virtually everything. Their economy has been expanding in a way that's so dramatic, I don't think it's ever been a period of history you've seen this kind of transformation. It's all at risk if, in fact, we see the spread of violence in that region. So they have a self-interest involved. And what we must do is persuade them that they have to join together with the Russians. And the Russians have come back, and there's a resurgent Russia today, and Mr. Putin and his successor can hit their chest. And they're pounding it, not in military terms, but in terms of using their new oil wealth, their energy power. And they have sent a signal to all the countries in the region and to Europe. Ukraine, by way of example, have a problem, they just shut down the flow of gas going to Ukraine. Well, it doesn't just affect the Ukrainians. Ukraine, in turn, cuts down the flow going into Europe. So you can see the muscle that is being developed by the Russians as well. What the Iranians are able to do is to split the national security, the UN Security Council. And so they've been able to divide the Chinese and the Russians over here, and you've got the Europeans and the US over here. And it seems to me that if China and Russia were to say to the Iranians, look, everybody agrees this is a bad idea. This is a very bad idea for Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Well, if we think it's a bad idea, let's do something to prevent them from going in that direction. And the way you do that, you send the signal, we're going to intensify the sanctions. We're going to intensify the sanctions with this hand, we're going to offer you something else in the other. And that is, here are the things that we can do for you. We can welcome you into the international community. We can pour billions of dollars into your country to develop the economy. You can raise the level of prosperity for your people, but you have to do so in a way that doesn't pose a threat to the stability in the region, and this is how we do it. That can be done, it has to be done, otherwise we're faced with the prospect of more and more nuclear weapons being spread around. A final point about the United States. What's our role in the world today? I was inspired when I talked earlier about that picture of photograph of Bill Clinton as a young man, 15 years old, I think he was at the time, reaching out and shaking President Kennedy's hand. It was a great moment in his life, and I think all of us were touched by that. I will never forget Kennedy's inaugural address. He said many things, but what stayed with me is the quote, let the word go forth, so to speak, that we will pay any price, we will bear any burden, we will defend any friend, we will oppose any foe in order to ensure the success and survival of liberty. Very inspiring words. The question is, do we do the same today? At the same today, now we have deficits which are unprecedented. Our dollar is low, as back in 1897. We've got enormous issues to deal with at home. Are we prepared to pay any price, bear any burden, oppose any foe, etc.? So it's a question of who are we as Americans? What is our role going to be in the future? Are we going to be the world's only superpower indefinitely? Or is there going to be a recognition that there are other powers who are coming up, and historically, whether you study Will Durant or whoever, that this has been the cycle of history throughout time, that democracies live very short, happy lives, but they excel and they recede. So we have to decide what's the role of the United States. Henry Kissinger, that Mac McLeody knows well, has written many books, and I love to read Henry Kissinger, but you've got to be a good reader. His books are this thick. Every page is profound. And you can get hung up, or I do at least, on one page saying, boy, I wish I could write like that. And Kissinger used to say, and I tried to imitate him, he said, I may not be a great writer, but if you read me, you'll be a great reader. Yeah. But he wrote a book, his last book that I recall was, Does America Need a Foreign Policy? I mean, a nice rhetorical question, does America need a foreign policy? And the answer, of course we need one. He said something in it very important to me. He was quoting an Australian philosopher. And the Australian philosopher said, the American people must come to accept the preeminence of American power throughout the world. We must do that, understand that it's almost an empire. We don't like to use that word. But if you think about our reach globally, from our economy, from our culture, from our athletics, we are pretty global in our reach. He said, we have to appreciate our global role and reach. But America should always try to conduct its foreign policy as if there are multiple powers of center. Multiple powers of center. What does that mean? It's fancy language for it's human relations 101. Treat other countries, treat other people as if they're important. Try to understand what their lives are like, what their culture is, their history, their experience, the lens through which they look and have to look at their daily lives. And if you have an appreciation for that, if you sit down and you treat other countries, treat other people as being important, you are far more able to persuade them of the value of your particular position. And so it wasn't Henry that came up with this, but it was actually a different writer. It was Shakespeare. In Measure for Measure, Act 2, Scene 2, great line, which was said, how excellent it would be to have the power of a tyrant. How tyrannous it would be to exercise it like a tyrant. And so what we have to do is understand that we have great power. We still, for all of our difficulties, we have great economic power. We still, for all of our difficulties, have great military power. But what we must try and do is to exercise it in a way that doesn't offend people, that builds bridges to people, that doesn't raise the animosity level against us, as has been done, to do what Joe Nye and Rich Armitage have written about through CSIS, called the smart power, the application of smart power. And that means taking all the levers at your disposal, from humanitarian assistance to economic development, to military measures if necessary, but to help lift countries up out of their misery, to help lift them up into a quality of life that they aspire to. You will win more hearts and minds through that process than anything else you can do. And I'll give you one example of it during the tsunami. Prior to the tsunami hitting off the coast of Indonesia, they had a poll taken that showed there was some 70% of the people had a very negative opinion of the United States. Following the tsunami, we sent in our aircraft carriers, delivering not bombs or bullets, but beds and blankets and medicine and cotton, all trying to provide relief to people who were in a desperate need. Guess what? 70% of the people had a favorable impression of the United States. So we have to do more of being concerned about how we treat other people and lifting them up if we hope to persuade their hearts and minds in that regard. And a final comment. This is a school dedicated to public service. And for me, one of the most important quotes I remember reading as a young man, again going to Congress, is John Gardner. And it was called The Recovery of Confidence. And he said something then which has stayed with me. He said, our institutions have become caught in a savage crossfire between uncritical lovers and unloving critics. And there was a wonderful juxtaposition of what he was talking about in terms of our public institutions. On the one hand, you had the uncritical lovers, people who are so enamored with the status quo they'll do everything they can to blunt and nullify any change, no matter how meritorious it might be. At the other end, you had the unloving critics, And what he was saying is between the unloving critics and the uncritical lovers, you had to have loving critics. That was the solution. You had to have people who saw that there were things that needed to be changed, but you should do so in a way that is constructive and positive and understand all of the good that is being done in our country. Understand that things have to change, that life is like an open river and not a closed pond, that we know in a moving stream there's life and regeneration, in a closed pond there's death and decay. And so his message was for all of us to become loving critics, to really appreciate the beauty of what we have, the glory of this great country, the promise that we have, and at the same time recognize that when there's things that are wrong, they have to be changed, and approach it with an idea that you are a loving critic. And I think that really is the mission. I hope it's part of the mission. Dean, where are you? I hope it's part of the mission of the school to build that particular character, that you approach every problem with a sense of being a loving critic. Let me end here and thank you very much for coming to listen to me carry on about my life, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Secretary. Thank you. More questions? Raise your hand right here. Denny, right behind you. Take the mic, please, Denny.
Mr. Cohen, taking a little play on some of the words you shared with us, what would be your perspective as you look backward from your experience and you look forward into the future on the draft and the lack of it in our country? Our nation has always supported our men and women in military service, continues to do so currently. But the strain it's placed on our National Guard and the states and the military families and the size of our armed forces, what would be your thinking as to what lies ahead for us in that area?
Can I give you two answers? If you talk to the professional military men and women, they will say the volunteer army is the best thing that we have produced, that we have people who want to be in the military. We're getting the best and the brightest, and they are performing magnificently, which they are. The problem we have in this country is that we're really not at war. This is not a country that is at war. You've got just a few narrow slice of America that's at war, and these kids are bearing that burden. And it's not fair that all of us should be out doing what we do, and we're not really engaged. And if I had one criticism to make, I said, look, it's up to the president to set the tone that it's not when we're in this situation, we need everybody involved. I'd like to have more volunteers. I'd like to have a call for more people to join the military. But not only that, Senator Nunn and I have started something called the Cohen Nunn Dialogues. And we're going around the country and we're talking about issues that have not been addressed. One of them we're going to talk about in Georgia by, I think, in early June. And these are living room kind of conversations that are open to the media and being covered live on the internet. And we're inviting participants from the audience to share in that. We're going to call for a national service program. Namely, we want everybody. We want everybody to contribute something to the common weal. We don't want to have just our military involved. We want everybody to understand this is something that our nation is at risk. The country is at peril with the threats that are out there, with not only the economic situation here, but the threats that we're going to have to face in the future. We want everybody involved. And so you can go in the military, you can go to the Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, you can do a number of things, but everybody ought to be sharing in this. And I don't have a sense that the nation's at war. The president talks about a war against terrorism. Number one, it's a misnomer. It's not a war against terrorism. Terrorism is not, it's not an enemy there. It's a tactic. But even so, you don't fight, for me, you don't fight this, I call it a long twilight struggle, using Kennedy's phrase. A long twilight struggle, not against communism, but against terrorism. And how do we wage that war? It's not going to be waged by the military, frankly. First, you're going to have good intelligence. We have to have good intelligence. We have to know what's going on in the world. We have to know what's going on in this country. Then we have to share that intelligence within our own bureaucracies. That's what the 9/11 Commission was all about, all of the vertical silos where people aren't talking to each other. And then we have to share that information on a global basis. You may recall last year where the Brits were able to intercept and stop a plan to blow up some 10 aircraft with 300 people aboard, and another 3,000 people who would be killed, murdered. They were able to do that through good police work. They had good information, good intelligence. They knocked on the door, broke the doors down, arrested the people, and now they're being held accountable. So good intelligence, good police work, good covert activity, and then the military as a last resort. And that's the way we have to build this sentiment. And I go around and talk to all of these guys. I say, look, don't think that you're immune, that this is our war against terrorism. Everybody is vulnerable today. There isn't a place that you or I can go anywhere in the world and be safe. You can't go to the beaches of Bali. You can't ride the trains in Madrid. You can't be in the subways in Tokyo. You can't ride the buses in London. There's no place that you can go and say that we are safe from these threats. So, if that's the case, how do we work together? Building these relationships, building the notion that we're really all in this together. And so that's what Senator Nunn and I are hoping to do in a small way, but to raise the level of debate and dialogue so that we can say, what are the critical issues facing us? One of them is you can't have a military as small as ours carry out the missions that they're carrying out for any length of time. And there are three options. You either get bigger, you reduce your commitments, which I don't recommend, or you do what you're doing now, and they change what they call tail-to-tooth ratio. You take it out of the support elements and put those support elements into the combat elements, and you leave the support to the private sector, which raises all kinds of other issues, doesn't it? Blackwater and other private security companies doing the work that otherwise our military would do if it were big enough. So we've got to persuade the American people that this is not just about Iraq. It's much bigger than Iraq, and that we've got to find a way to come together on how we resolve our issue in Iraq. I say it's not so much when we leave Iraq, but how we leave, how we leave the country, and how we are seen as leaving the country. That becomes important because other countries make a judgment about you. They say, well, they killed about 4,000 Americans, and then Americans decided that they had enough and they left. Now, what does that mean? It means that other countries start to calibrate what their relationship is with you. In other words, do they see another country that is more to their liking in terms of their security interests, or do they start building their own security interests? So how we are seen becomes critically important to our foreign policy and our security policy for the future. So we've got much more to do.
Sanford, we have a question in the back.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, my name is Sanford Johnson. I'm a student here at the Clinton School, and I'm honored to have you here today. We'll have a new Secretary of Defense in January of 2009. And based on your experience and the conditions on the ground in Iraq, what do you think should be the first step that the new Secretary of Defense should make in the, I decided to keep the name out, the next president's Iraq war policy?
I think he has to establish, you hear this phrase, coalition of the willing. Well, you need a coalition of the willing on Capitol Hill as well. The first thing that any Secretary of Defense needs to do is to go meet with the people he's going to have to deal with on Capitol Hill. They're the ones who ultimately control, they do control the purse strings, but they ultimately will have a control over whether we stay or go or how we expand. And so building relations domestically up on the Hill is very important. Secondly, the job of the Secretary of Defense is to go internationally and build relations with our allies and say, we need you. You may not have liked the way we took action in the past, but that's in the past. I'm a new secretary. We have a new policy. We've got a new president, and we need to have a new relationship here. I am disturbed, frankly, when Secretary Gates raises the issue about NATO not doing enough in Afghanistan. And he says some nations aren't carrying their weight, and suddenly he comes under a barrage of criticism. Well, the fact is that we're carrying the weight. Yes, other countries are helping out, but you can't get them to put more troops in. And then secondly, think about this, it is so difficult for a commander in NATO in Afghanistan because some of the countries who are contributing troops say, can't go to this region where there's danger. If it's a greater danger here, we don't want our troops there. So now what you're seeing is a two-tier system in our NATO alliance. something is fundamentally wrong with the fact that, okay, Americans go where there's danger, or the Brits and Americans go where there's danger, and the others stay over here. Can't happen that way. There was a book written a few years ago by Robert Kagan called A Paradise in Power. And in that book, he pointed out that, and it stirred a lot of controversy. It really got people angry. He said that Americans were from Mars and Europeans were from Venus. And the Europeans took great exception to that, saying the feminization of their military was erroneous. But what he was getting at is precisely, look at the contributions to the military throughout the European theater, way down, with the exception of the British and the French. We're starting to see a little bit come back. I'm going to Canada tonight, and the Canadians have started to increase their defense capability. But if you look at the other nations, they are really getting a free ride when it comes to the United States carrying the bulk of the effort. So we're going to have a two-tier system. That's not going to sit well with the United States and the American people, I don't think. And so we've got to make it clear to them we're all in it together. You've got to make contributions. You've got to put your troops in harm's way as well as we do. Otherwise, it's not really going to be a viable organization for the future. So I would say build your relations on Capitol Hill. Make sure you talk to the American people about what the needs are, and then go over and persuade our allies that they're in it with us.
Bob's got
Your discussion of tyranny and the quote from Shakespeare was somewhat reminiscent, I think, of what Senator Fulbright called the arrogance of power. And just as our eventual leaving of Southeast Asia, I think we could agree, raised the stature of the country, at least in that region, and maybe throughout the world, would our timely exit from Iraq do the same to help mitigate the dangers in that area and raise our stature in the world as well?
I don't think there's any question about the perception of the arrogance. That's something that is out there, it's deep-seated. I had the first Cohen Nunn dialogues in George Washington University about 3 weeks ago. If you're interested, you can get it on csis.com, and you'll see about an hour and 15-minute dialogue, conversation between General Zinni, Tony Zinni, former commander of the Central Command. We had Christiana Mampour, reporter for CNN, and we had Andrew Kohut from Pew Center Research, and talking about what's happened to our image and our reputation in the world. And it's not at a high level right now in many parts of the world, not only with our adversaries, but also with our allies, because of the perception that we've been arrogant in our use of power. So how do we get our credibility back? That's going to be that's part of the question you asked me before, getting the credibility back, and that is sitting down with countries and saying, okay, what do we do here? We didn't invite you in the beginning, but we need you now. And if you're not with us now, then I would say this, that whoever is president, whether it's President McCain or President Clinton or Obama, each of them are going to have to face up to this issue. What happens when you take office and you see the situation on the ground? You have made pledges, some to stay longer, others to start moving out. But what happens if the thing starts to unravel? What are you prepared to do? I've always been cautious. I've urged candidates, I haven't talked to any of these candidates, but candidates, be cautious of what you pledge. You may recall that Jimmy Carter, when he ran for office, one of the first pledges he made that he was going to withdraw 5,000 troops from South Korea. I was on a delegation to China with Senator Nunn, Senator Hart, and Senator John Glenn. And after our visit to China, we came back through South Korea, met with the president, who was assassinated later, but it was President Kim. And we met with him, and he said, this is going to be disastrous for us. If you take 5,000 troops out, this is going to send a signal to the north that you're leaving, the beginning of leaving, and you could precipitate a conflict on the peninsula. We went back, thanks to Senator Nunn, who is from Georgia, but all of us met with President Carter, and we had a long session with him. We said, we think it's inadvisable to do this. And to his credit, he reversed himself, and he didn't pull 5,000 out. Now, I'm not saying the same thing applies here, but I think anyone who takes that office has got to deal with the reality on the ground. I would recommend that whoever is president, you go to the region and say, here is the problem. I cannot, as much as I might want to stay here for indefinitely to help stabilize the region, I don't have political support back home. It's strongly in the other direction. You know what the consequences are going to be if we leave. Therefore, I'm asking you now that you must contribute financially, and you must contribute from a security point of view. You must help stabilize this region, because as much as I want to stay, it's not going to be possible. And I think that has to be done. That message has to go. Now, I don't favor setting a strict timetable. We're coming out in such and such a day with so many troops. I don't advocate that. But I think the message has to go to the leaders of those countries. We need you. And if we don't have you, I can't sustain my commitment, this country's commitment to the region. And that means it could be a disaster for all of us. So please come in and be a part of this. So that's what I think has to be done in the future.
As y'all have heard, Secretary Cohen has got to fly to Canada tonight, so we've just got time for a couple more questions. Joyce, right here.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I must say, as a former jock myself, basketball player and English teacher, you might have gotten a B on your sonnet in my class. I think you would have. But today, on the flight from Dallas to Little Rock, I sat with a young man who was on leave from Iraq for 18 days, and he talked the whole way and had so many things he wanted to say. And your comments, I think, really encapsulated his biggest disappointment, your comment about the loving critics. And one of the things that he kept saying to me is that we're not robots, we have minds, we're thinkers. And he's really disappointed that the American people are not engaging in loving criticism, not just about the war, but in general, because he figures that's one of the things for which he's fighting. And I'd like to know your assessment as to why you think we are not engaged in that constitutional obligation that I think we have.
Well, you know, I'm encouraged recently by what is taking place. You're seeing Senator Obama bring out more and more people. Senator Clinton staying in the race, say, I'm in it to the finish. That has generated enormous public interest. I think that I take encouragement from that. I think that more people are getting involved finally, and that sitting on the sidelines is not an option any longer. But I think what we have to do, you set the tone at the top. You set the tone at the top. And what I've always objected to, frankly, in terms of the government, people usually run against the government. People usually talk about bureaucrats, and you say bureaucrats, and it's something negative. Well, these are public servants. These are people who make the machinery of government work. And you can't keep knocking it and then expect that people won't have their morale impacted. And so what we have to do is saying, you know, government, as a Republican, I say this, government is an enemy until you need a friend. I mean, think about it. You know, we don't like regulation, but you like regulating the airlines in terms of safety regulation. Do you want more inspections or fewer? So you start looking at how about goods coming into the country. Now, we criticize the Chinese, and there's a lot to criticize in terms of toothpaste and pet food and all kinds of things where they've lost quality control. But what about us? Don't we have an obligation to have some kind of mechanism in place to start checking on the quality of what's coming into the country? Or do we just say, look, that's free enterprise and let it go? So, or with the SEC, or what's taking place with the subprime mortgages? You know, where has the, quote, government been? Do we want less regulation, more? We need to have accountability. What is really missing in this country, what is so distressful to me, is that we have lost the commitment to the virtues and the values that made this country great. I am fond of quoting from Walter Lippmann. And Lippmann had to address the 30th reunion of the class of 1910 at Harvard. And he looked out to these classmates. He said, you know something? Every time we had a tough decision to make, we took the easy way out. Following World War I and the horrors of World War I, what did we do? We cut our military, we started opening the champagne, we were passing the bubbly, and there was a mechanized evil at loose throughout Europe. And here we are on the edge of another world war. He said, this is the standard to which the wise shall now repair. You took the good things for granted, and now you must earn them again. For every right that you have a duty you must perform. For every hope that you entertain, you have an obligation you must fulfill. And for every good that you wish to achieve, you will have to sacrifice your comfort and your ease because there's nothing for nothing any longer. Now, those were pretty powerful words back in 1940, but they're pretty powerful words today. We have lost a sense of virtue about accountability, that people can do whatever they do and that no one is held responsible. And so what we've got to do is have a rekindling of confidence, a return to those stern virtues of saying we know right and we know wrong. We know that there must be regulations. We're not calling for a total state control, but we've got to have regulations on things that are important to our lives. How we travel, the safety of that travel, the goods that are coming into our country. We've got to put in place a mechanism to ensure the American people that they're going to be safe. And frankly, we've seen a relaxation of those standards. We've been told that deficits don't matter. We've been told that that the free enterprise system will take care of all of our issues. We need a combination. We need to stop treating the government as the enemy. We need to have a responsible government. We need to have a structure in place that measures up to our responsibilities, and frankly, we have not had that, and we need to return to that. I'm pretty encouraged by seeing that people who are now excited about the campaign, but I think we need to sustain it. It can't be over when the campaign is over. We can't return to what we've been doing, and hopefully what Senator Nunn and I are trying to do, and others, Senator Boren in Oklahoma as well, can hope rekindle the sense of confidence we need to regain.
Final question, Bob Sells.
Thank you for being here. Most of us in this room would probably classify ourselves as just slightly above average. And for that reason, we find it illuminating the things that you're telling us. But you're only here one day or one night. And so we have to rely on our local newspaper or Time Magazine or CNN News or something to keep us informed and knowledgeable about what's going on.
You can read my books.
I would like to know what you read, what you recommend we read, what we listen to. And if you have the courage, who would you recommend we not listen to or not read?
Now, that's a good way to end it. That's a good final question.
You know, my thought is you should listen to everybody. You should listen to people you don't agree with. We had a discussion earlier. Dean Rutherford, we had a discussion earlier about Ahmadinejad going to Colombia. Now, I had my problems with it, not that he was invited to come to Colombia, but that the president of the school then degraded him in his introduction, and basically just, I think he took away all of the importance of having Ahmadinejad there. And I have never been afraid of having an idea hit me. What I think has to happen is we have to be open to everything. Say, okay, what are our adversaries saying? Why are they thinking this way? Let me counter it. And so I read everything I get my hands on. I read opening in the morning. I get very little sleep, but I get up and I go to the internet first and see all of the papers on the internet. Sometimes I do it at midnight, but usually at 4:30 in the morning I start reading all of the major papers, and then I like to have them in my hand as well. But I read the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times. I read Economist Magazine, Time, Newsweek. What else? I do watch CNN. I do watch MSNBC, and I read as many books as I can. So it's trying to absorb as much information from different sources. And then making a judgment in terms of what really strikes me as being accurate here. Now, most people don't have the time to do that or don't want to do that, and you depend upon your elected officials or others, community leaders, to give you some direction. But I think the best thing is to read as much as you can and listen as closely as you can and be willing to face and debate an issue with someone who has a different opinion. I must tell you, I'll close on this because the poetry's been important to me. I must tell you, one time I was walking across the state and I was really tired, and I decided I was going to go into the woods and sit down in the shade of the trees. And I remember I wrote something down. It wasn't very good poetry, but it was something to the effect that what I said was, I look at these trees. I look at these statuesque trees, and I said, I wish I could just be an oak tree. Just look at that magnificent tree. And I penned something like this. Man stands tense to step among the stars, his jargon brimming with non-declining quasars. And soon he'll tell us whether life exists on Mars. Now, the thought of being laminated to a ray of light is heavy seed indeed. But if the choice were mine to make, knowing life to be at stake, I would choose to know the secret of the oak tree. Caring not of ancestry, indifferent to history, satisfied it seems to be. And I said, wouldn't it be great just to be and not have to do? And then I thought about it. I said, no. I said, every one of us can't be and shouldn't be oak trees, because our gift in life is to do things. It's not simply to be, it's to do. And all of us who are in this room, we've each had something to do in building a family, building a community, building a business, building a better life for other people. And so we are meant with all the burdens that entails, not just to be, but to do. And I think that's the essence of what all of us need to do. We have to do. And so we carry this life of ours to its cosmic conclusions, but with the notion that we have done something to better the lives of others. And that's what I hope